Stephen Whitfield, and it's the Ecology of Gopher Tortoises in Pine Rocklands Habitat in Miami, Florida.
Hi, thank you all. Can you hear me? Thank you all for coming. It's nice to be able to have a chance to talk with you about some of the work we've been doing in Miami with gopher tortoises. I'm a conservation biologist at Zoo Miami, and we've been working with tortoises there for the past few years. I don't know if it's working.
One sec.
Oh. Okay, so here's a kind of map of South Florida. I had to create my own range map for the gopher tortoises because a lot of them leave Miami off, which kind of undermines the point of my talk. Miami is definitely the southern part of the species range. It's a unique habitat for the tortoises, and there's a number of kind of unique challenges this far south. First off, Miami has very limited upland habitat. That habitat is very rocky. I'll show an image in a minute. And there is rapid, extensive urbanization. Miami didn't exist 100 years ago, and it has basically taken over a very large area of all of the upland habitat in the past 100 years. So that's a challenge for tortoises. There are few populations, and what's difficult to tell with tortoises this far south is whether they're the relics of a much larger historic population or if they are pets that people have released. You might have heard that we have lots of issues with introduced reptiles in Miami. And a review of the literature published since 2000 indicates there have been 2 reports of gopher tortoises in Miami. So that's where we're starting in terms of what we know about tortoises in Miami-Dade County. It's not a lot. This is what upland habitat in Miami-Dade looks like. It's what we call pine rockland. Here is pine and here is rock. It is a unusual oolitic limestone, and you can see there's basically no soil here. That is a challenge for burrowing tortoises. You may be surprised that there are tortoises there at all, but you wouldn't be the first. In 1920, Charles Torrey Simpson, who was one of the first naturalists to move down to Miami, wrote a book about the natural history of South Florida, and he expressed surprise that tortoises were living in places like this, in rock. And he pointed out very well that they find these sandy pockets, and that's where they dig their burrows. So this is really important because this is evidence that, at least historically, there were tortoises in Miami-Dade County, and they appeared to be more widespread. We also have a lot of historical accounts of people hunting and eating tortoises and selling tortoise soup out of hotels in Miami. So this can in part explain why, with a rapidly growing city, the tortoises could have disappeared relatively quickly. There's also historical physical evidence. Perhaps people were misidentifying tortoises and you think that they were actually seeing, I don't know, some other turtle. There is physical evidence. Tequesta are the Native Americans the pre-Columbian people, and there are tortoise shells present in their middens, basically their trash piles, in far southern Miami. There are also several voucher specimens of tortoises collected in the 1960s and 1970s, though nothing collected since then. And these yellow X's indicate places where those voucher specimens were collected. So this is just kind of an image of Miami. Most of the area is the Everglades. It's seasonally or flooded year-round. And this is the kind of Miami Rock Ridge. So this is where the tortoise vouchers come from. And these 2 orange points are where we know there are tortoise populations today. One of them is a county park called the Deering Estate. And one of them, very conveniently for me, is the area directly surrounding Zoo Miami. So this is an area, what we call the Richmond Pine Rocklands. It used to be the Richmond Naval Air Base. It was a World War II era blimp base. This feature right here, which is now our parking lot, is where the blimps would land. But because it was owned by the military, it was protected from urbanization all around it. And the orange area indicates the extent of the old blimp base, but the black indicates the area owned by Zoo Miami. So you can see tigers and lions and rhinos in here, and gopher tortoises in the pine rockland surrounding it. There are also a number of reserves that are contiguous with Zoo Miami's property, county parks, private, kind of close to the public reserve. This site right here is being developed into a Walmart. So there's enormous pressure on this habitat at the moment. But these yellow circles indicate places where we found burrows on zoo property to date. So it's a unique upland habitat at a whopping nearly 5 meters of elevation. That's about as high as Miami gets. Oolitic limestone and mineral soil. The vegetation is really interesting. It's a Dade County slash pine is an endemic variety of slash pine. There's a very diverse understory, many endemic plants. There's about 50 state-threatened plant species, 5 or 6 federally endangered plant species, and lots of invasives as well. So I think of Miami's flora and fauna as about 50% endangered and 50% invasive. It's a really interesting place to do research. And there's threats from habitat fragmentation, fire suppression, invasive plants and animals. So the objectives of our overall project are to kind of characterize the population biology within the Richmond tract, understand habitat use and home ranges of the species, understand reproductive biology because it's so far south and there's been some indication that reproduction may occur year-round, understand major sources of mortality. Because the pine rocklands are a critically endangered ecosystem, it's really important for us to understand the role of these keystone species in the habitat. And we're focused on creating public awareness and outreach. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is come up with some unique management plans for the tortoises in this unusual habitat. I'm not going to talk about these 3 things today because I have students who are presenting posters on them, but I think that they're really interesting, and so please check those out at the poster session. All right, so population characteristics. We presume that there was a wild historic population at the Richmond tract going back, however long. Since 2005, the curator of herpetology at the zoo has been marking individual tortoises, and they found 42 adult gopher tortoises since 2005. So that's some indication of the number of tortoises out there. We also know that there have been 2 documented population supplements. 39 juveniles were introduced by FWC, the Florida Wildlife Agency, in 2006. And at some point in the mid-1990s, there was an unknown number of tortoises brought in from a nearby cemetery. I don't know why they think that burrowing tortoises and graves are incompatible, but since I started working at the zoo in 2015, we found 16 different adults. 13 of those are at Zoo Miami, and 3 are from adjacent properties within the Richmond tract. And we found 14 small juveniles, presumably less than a year old. So we do see that there's consistent reproduction, and we've mapped about 80 burrows. So I'm hesitant to come up with a population number, but there's a number of ways you can use this to kind of inform how many individuals there would be. Since we're also really interested in reproductive phenology, one of the great things about working at a zoo is that we have an animal hospital. And so we can pick up females and take them to our digital radiography center. They give us a quick snapshot of whether there's shelled eggs inside. So we've been doing this to try to understand the reproductive biology for the past couple years. Here's a few of those results. In these females, you can see shelled eggs. The dates where we've detected eggs are from the beginning of April to the beginning of June. This is pretty consistent with the rest of the range. We've seen no evidence for a second clutch in the year, which is something that we were kind of expecting. But we've had limited sampling of the females between August and October, which is when maybe there will be a second clutch. I'm kind of doubtful that that's going to happen. And our mean clutch size is 10.5, which is a little bit larger than I think normal. So that's what we know about reproductive phenology. We also have been trying to understand mortality and population threats. We've seen 2 mortality events from adults since 2015. One was an auto collision, and one was entrapment in some construction debris. There's no real barrier between the pine rockland habitat and working areas of the zoo, so tortoises move back and forth between lawns, and there's lots of opportunities for them to face problems. And one of the really unique sources of mortality at Zoo Miami is our biosecurity moats. So in addition to a fence, we have a large moat which keeps animals like rhinos or elephants from escaping. It's a kind of a last line of defense. Not that that happens very often. But you can see these are about 3 meters deep and 3 meters wide. And they are kind of death traps for the tortoises. We knew that tortoises occasionally fell into the moats, but earlier this year we did a transect through about 4 kilometers of the moat, and we found 6 tortoise shells in that 4-kilometer transect. So it's hard to know over what period those tortoises fell into the moat. If anyone knows how long it takes for a tortoise shell to decompose completely, that would be great to know. But we also found 2 live tortoises in the moats. So we don't think that they're actually falling into the moat and dying from the impact. Instead, what happens is that some parts of the moat flood really deep during the wet season, and we think what happens is the tortoises get into places where they ultimately drown. While we did find 6 dead tortoises in the moat and 2 live ones, we've also been doing radio telemetry with the tortoises for the past year or so, and only 2 tortoises have fallen into the moat over that period. One of them is one of the tortoises that we recovered from the moat, and he keeps going back. So apart from him, only 1 tortoise has fallen into the moat of the ones we've been following, and some of them do have ranges that go just up against the moat. So this is a kind of unique source of mortality that we don't know how to deal with. We also have a lot of problems with collecting or transport by people. One of the tortoises that we've marked in a public park adjacent to Zoo Miami has been, people love to bring tortoises to the zoo. It's weird. I get a call about once a month from someone who wants to give us a gopher tortoise, and we always tell them just to put it back. But this one tortoise, number 528, from a reserve adjacent to the zoo, has been brought to us 3 times in the past 3 years by people who picked it up and wanted to know what to do with it. So people moving tortoises around is probably a really big issue, given that a lot of these reserves are public access and there's a lot of people. And we also know, based on some surveying we've done, that tortoises at Zoo Miami show past exposure to both species of mycoplasma, but we haven't seen any clinical signs, so they don't appear to be sick. So these are all kind of threats that we're thinking about with the tortoises. And we're also focused on a lot of public outreach and awareness. And what's really cool about working at a zoo is that people come to learn about animals, and so we can teach them things. We've got a really good teen training program, a teen volunteer program called the Conservation Teen Scientist Program. And the Gopher Tortoise Council actually gave us a grant for an environmental education grant, where we take this conservation teen scientist students out to the field with us for a day, and then they attend a tortoise education booth and talk with visitors at the zoo about their experience doing tortoise conservation. And so here they are with one of the collection tortoises at Zoo Miami. And we're also working on a campaign to get signs up all around parks throughout the county so people understand there are tortoises here, that's natural, please leave them alone. So overall, there are tortoises in Miami. I hope I've convinced you of that. And they are a historical population. There's probably only 2 surviving populations and not that many individuals between the 2 of them. At the Richmond tract, at least we know there is consistent reproduction, but probably low population size. There are major threats, despite small population size, few remaining habitats and harassment by people, and limited public awareness that tortoises exist at all in the region. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone.